Hello, my name is Mallory Jenna Robinson. Join me on A Hateful Homicide, a true crime podcast dedicated to telling the stories regarding the murders of transgender, gender non-binary, and gender diverse community members in the United States and abroad. This is A Hateful Homicide.
911, what's your emergency?
Yeah. A transgender woman has been shot and killed in North Baltimore. Alpha?
In the U.S., trans women of color have a life expectancy of just 35 years.
This happens on a daily. Another one of my friends got killed right up the street from here.
These cases are true. The victims are real, and their voices matter. This is A Hateful Homicide. The murder of Kedarie Candace Johnson. Wednesday, March 2nd, 2016, Burlington, Iowa. Warning. The following episode you're about to listen to will contain evidence of misgendering. Listening discretion is advised.
Resident Jenna Sansoni lives only a few hundred feet from the spot where Kedarie Johnson's body was found. Tell me what you heard the night that Kedarie Johnson was killed.
I heard 3 gunshots.
Did you know immediately there were gunshots?
Yes. I need to call 911.
Des Moines County 911, what's location of your emergency?
Have you gotten any calls about some really loud bangs within the last 10 minutes?
Yes, we have over by 4th and Walnut.
Yes.
That's scary. And I put down the phone and I stepped out on my porch, which is probably not a good idea, and couldn't see anything. And so I just ran to the edge of the driveway with the first arriving cops. I'm a retired nurse thinking, gosh, if somebody got shot, maybe I can help. And one of the cops came out and shook his head. Then we had the crime scene people showed up and started taping things off. And
can you explain to me how this crime affected this neighborhood and this city?
I think it brought a different kind of an awareness to people. It was just so brutal and so out of the ordinary that it just really put everybody back.
It's Wednesday, March 2nd, 2016, in Burlington, Iowa, just a few hours south of Des Moines. 16-year-old gender non-conforming as well as gender non-binary teenager Kedarie, also affectionately known as Candace, was hanging out with some friends earlier that day when they as well had went along to a store. And when they went to the store, one of the things that they encountered was someone by the name of Jorge Sanders. Not directly though. The two had not officially met, but they would pass each other inside of that store. However, within a few hours, by 10:30 p.m. on the night of March 2nd, Kedarie would be found dead in the alleyway off of 4th Street. Now, what's interesting as we begin to go through this case, welcome everyone. This is our first case that really talks about gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, and I'm so excited to be able to share that piece of knowledge with our listeners who may not know much about our beautiful non-binary and gender non-conforming community. And then I'm also just, excited to be able to share the story with you of Kedarie and to raise awareness around the violence that is happening towards our gender non-conforming, fluid, gender non-conforming community members. So again, this case involves a lot of twists and turns. It's going to take years to come to a conclusion. Throughout this case, we're going to hear footage from the trial, from the victim, Kedarie Johnson, that is Kedarie's mom. So we're going to be hearing footage from both of those events throughout this episode. So I'm excited again to have you all tuning in and listening in. We're going to go through and talk about what it means to express yourself, to identify with neither gender, and then also navigating that through a space, and also really understanding who Kedarie was, right? Because they really was bold and outspoken and proud of who they were in high school. And one of the things that really resonated with me with this case was the ability to resonate with Kedarie, because we both, you know, I came out as trans at 16 in 2006, and Kedarie was already being so proud and bold on social media and throughout school, and a very well-liked teen as well. So again, it really, really very supported school. Fortunately, the perpetrators of this case were not classmates of Kedarie's. So these were individuals that Kedarie had not known prior. But Kedarie's high school experience overall was relatively good, especially with those close friends of theirs. But again, as we prepare to go through this case, we're going to dive in and really start talking about some of those specifics. And that's what we're going to go into right now. I want to again take you back to the night of March 2nd of 2016. It's a cold night, you know, just a week before, you know, spring break in Burlington. It's a couple of weeks before St. Patrick's Day, and it's a cold winter night in Burlington, Iowa. And 16-year-old Kedarie, aka Candace, had spent that Wednesday at school, and then also leaving school and going to hang out with a few friends. Well, around that evening, around 8 p.m., Kedarie is seen on camera at a grocery store. And that grocery store, Kedarie goes in there, you know, browses around, and you can see this on CCTV footage. And what's really interesting is that Kedarie is navigating through the store, getting, you know, shopping around, browsing around. It's a little after 8 o'clock on March 2nd, you know, carefree Kedarie, you know, just having a good time. And in walks Jorge and Jaron. And these two names are going to be very pivotal because they both are cisgendered men. One was 28 by the name of Jaron Purham, cisgendered black male. And then you had 23-year-old biracial, multiracial Jorge Sander Galvez. And so what's really interesting is that these two individuals who are the perpetrators of this case and was ultimately convicted as we go through this, but what's, again, you highlighted what's visible throughout the CCTV footage on March 2nd is that you see them go inside of the store as well as Kedarie's walking through. However, they do not meet inside the store. What we see on that CCTV footage, my audience, is Kedarie leaving the store around 8:30. They had actually stayed around and kind of used the Wi-Fi to, you know, just also check in with some friends because there was like a local coffee shop that was inside of this grocery store that also had Wi-Fi for customers. And so Kedarie was utilizing that Wi-Fi. And as they're using that Wi-Fi, you know, you can see again Jaron and you can see George come in to the store. You know, again, it could be suggested that they were looking for cis women at that time. They were known for bringing cis women back into their apartment, which was, you know, not necessarily in Burlington, but they were known for having women over. So we do believe that on that night, that Wednesday night of March 2nd, 2016, and it was a winter night, it was snowing, it was cold. So in that footage, you can see Kedarie covered up in layers of, you know, jackets and, you know, and really just trying to get home. They lived with their mom, Katrina, and a sibling. And so Kedarie was really well loved, coming from a single parent household. Katrina spoke fondly and will speak fondly of of Kedarie and just how proud of Kedarie as a mom she was for Kedarie standing in their truth and always being bold and just navigating through spaces, but always was afraid for Kedarie's safety. Definitely made mention of that very often. When Kedarie first identified on the sexual orientation spectrum as queer and or gay, again, Katrina was very supportive of that relationship and that whole process for Kedarie. But again, always worried that Kedarie could be placed in violent situations. And so one of the things that Katrina wanted to do as a single mom, right, because Kedarie is Black, is African American, the victim in this case. And so Iowa, which is a very, predominantly white state, of course, has, and on and off, again, has had its issues, racial relations, especially in the bigger city like Des Moines. And so Katrina wanted to have a fresh start for Kedarie and Kedarie's younger sibling. And with that being said, they relocated to Burlington, Iowa around 2014, just as Kedarie was beginning their freshman year of high school. So Kedarie really got the opportunity to go into high school in a new space and really be themselves. And as Kedarie was going through high school from freshman year to sophomore year, they really began to express wearing effeminate clothing, wearing clothing that was very identifying of them and their gender expression. And so Kedarie then around 2015 came out to their mom as gender nonconforming and gender non-binary. Now, Katrina at this time was again very supportive, but was always very worried for Kedarie's safety. Not necessarily in high school, though there was some evidence of bullying in certain spaces within the high school, because we do have to be understanding, or not understanding, but also cognizant of the fact that, not everyone's always going to be as supportive. Even though I came from a supportive high school, there were classmates who were not the most supportive. So you do get that in spaces, even as liberal or open as they may be. So again, Kedarie was very well received in high school and even began to express, and you could see Kedarie began to wear braids and longer hairstyles and was very, very open in their gender fluidity. So as we go into this case again, I want to take you into the night of Kedarie Johnson's murder. And so this hateful homicide, it again happened when Kedarie was leaving that night. It was around 8:45 p.m. On March 2nd, Kedarie leaves the grocery store, heads out. The outside CCTV footage, you can see Kedarie on their phone. Looks like they're checking some messages, and then looks like they also have a phone call. At this time, as Kedarie is leaving the grocery store, Jaron and Jorge had already left the store. And so they were in their car, and you could see them leaving out of the parking lot. So that is how Kedarie crosses paths with Jorge and Jaron. And what happens next is that they pull up next to Kedarie, who's getting ready to go home, trying to make it in time for curfew as a 16-year-old. And they ask Kedarie if they would like to hang out. And Kedarie agreed. So Kedarie gets into the vehicle. The thing is that according to Jaron, when they picked up Kedarie, they were under the assumption that Kedarie was cisgendered female. And so because as we continue to go through the case, Kedarie at the time was female presenting. And so they had that assumption that Kedarie identified as cisgendered female. And with that being said, they all get into the car and then they drive off back to Jaron and Jorge's apartment. There, the two guys were hoping to partake in a menage a trois, threesome sexual relationship with Kedarie. Kedarie was not comfortable with that, but did, express that they were fine with hanging out, playing video games, for a little bit, but did still need to get home. Well, according to Jaron, Jorge, who was very much attracted to Kedarie, really started to make moves towards Kedarie, and this was probably around 9:30 that night on March 2nd, and Kedarie began to get uncomfortable and was ready to go home. So Kedarie stated that they were not comfortable with being intimate with Jorge, and Jorge in that moment began to get a little suspicious. Why is it that? Because Jorge, who is this multiracial, cisgendered guy who in his own egocentric mind felt that he was, the most attractive person out there, and how dare Kedarie refuse to engage in sex with him. And as a result, Jorge snaps. And this is according to Jaron, right? Because we have to start really looking into the series of events of this case and how all of this unfolded. And so that night, inside of the apartment, Jorge snaps. He begins to strangle Kedarie, taking a plastic bag and shoving the plastic bag down Kedarie's throat. Kedarie is then placed inside of the car, thrown into the alleyway off of 4th, shot several times, and then doused with bleach before Jorge and Jaron drove off. And this was around 10 p.m. on March 2nd, 2016, within an hour and a half of Kedarie going to the grocery store, leaving the grocery store, getting into the car with Jorge and Jaron, going to the apartment, and then being dumped along the side of the alleyway. This all happened so quickly. And what's so heartbreaking about this case is that these perpetrators were not arrested right away. They weren't even on the radar. What happened is that there was so many twists and turns, as we mentioned. And what's interesting is that as we go through this, you really start to understand how this case unfolds. So when Kedarie's body, blood-soaked body, in the snow, in the hail, in the rain, right? All of these cold elements bleeding out, bags stuffed down Kedarie's throat, unable to breathe. As this is happening, Kedarie's laying there, afraid. Jorge and Jaron gets away. And because the body was dumped in the alley where Kedarie was also shot, 911 calls were immediately placed. And that was one of the reasons that Kedarie's body was found quickly. And Kedarie's identity and ID card was available, so they were able to ID Kedarie and go back and backtrack Kedarie's steps. But again, this took a while. And during this time, Kedarie's mom is beginning to become worried. She hasn't seen Kedarie. She has no idea where they are. The last time she spoke with Kedarie, they were at the grocery store and was scheduled to be getting home within the next hour. And so again, around the same time as Kedarie's been shot, Katrina is now anxiously starting to worry about, where is Kedarie? This is very out of the normal for Kedarie to not make it home for curfew. And so Katrina and Kedarie's younger sibling goes out and starts looking for Kedarie, tracing those last steps. And at the same time, you have the detectives from the Burlington Police Department who are now on scene, who have received these 911 calls and have been dispatched over to the scene of the crime where this hateful homicide of Kedarie took place. And this teenage tragedy, it unfolded right there in this alleyway. This poor 16-year-old kid who was just 4 months shy of turning 17 and getting ready to enter into their junior year of high school. Life had snuffed out. And what's sad about this is that as we continue to go through this case, you really get this idea of, and the tabloids and the headlines have described it as catfishing, right? Kedarie was catfishing. And that is where this story of blaming and shaming the victim, where a hateful homicide comes in and combats that, right? Because regardless, Kedarie was going home. Kedarie wanted to just have a good time and hang out with some potential new friends. And they, as the adults in this situation, targeted someone who they thought was cisgendered female, and then went under the assumption to then, who knows if it was going to be a consensual sex act, right? Because Kedarie had already, according to Jaron, declined to even partake in any form of sex with George. And so George, who becomes enraged, then, and suspicious at this time too, because how dare Kedarie rejects them, then results in this hateful homicide with Jaron's participation. So let's not forget that he's some innocent bystander, right? He definitely made sure he helped transport the body to the alleyway, and then also participated in the gunshots that were fired into Kedarie's body. And so this case again is really just, it's just so sad, but Kedarie's body is identified, and Katrina goes back home. It's around 11:30 p.m. and she gets a knock on the door. And as she answers the door, detectives Jaron Johnson and Mark Aronson arrives to the door, and they make the death notification. The 16-year-old Kedarie, also affectionately known as Candace, has been found dead just a little over an hour ago. Katrina is distraught, rightfully so, baffled as to what happened to her child, who was on their way home from the store and who had just spent that day at school and hanging out with friends afterwards, and has now been the victim of a hateful homicide, all because of what? And Katrina's fears is it because of how Kedarie identified? And Detectives Johnson and Aronson wanted that information as well. They wanted to understand a little bit about Kedarie, because as they discovered Kedarie's body, they discovered Kedarie in female undergarments. They discovered Kedarie with a bra, and feminine other garments. And so they wanted to really get an understanding of who Kedarie was and how they identified. And Katrina conveyed that information to, the detectives who was involved in this case, and shares that yes, Kedarie identified as gender non-binary. The detectives weren't really quite sure of what that meant, and so Katrina really gave a detailed information of Kedarie's life, from moving from Des Moines to Burlington for a fresh start, and where the Kedarie was able to get into this idea of being able to express and be and identify who they truly were, but not necessarily conforming to any form of gender, but like to express in feminine clothing and then also express in masculine clothing, and would also socially transition occasionally by using the name of Candace. And so this information is conveyed to the detectives, and they was wondering if that is what happened here, because of the nature of Kedarie's body being found where the sweater that Kedarie was wearing, these layers of clothing in this icy cold weather, as well as the undergarments being exposed. Detectives was wondering if this was a sexual-based crime, meaning that they went under the assumption, the perpetrators went under the assumption that Kedarie was cis female, then discovered that Kedarie was not. And then this is how the crime unfolded. The detectives wanted to just hold off on that theory to, Katrina. But Katrina was already conveying the same suspicions, stating that she always, worried for Kedarie's safety, though the high school was safe, which is one of the things that the detectives wanted to understand was there someone from Kedarie's high school, a classmate? Was there any form of online bullying? Was any of these factors into play during the events of March 2nd, 2016? And according to Katrina, no, Kedarie was very well received in high school, had a lot of great friends. There was a couple of classmates who weren't the most affirming, but nonetheless, it was never an unsafe environment for Kedarie. And so detectives did, of course, as the investigation began, Thursday morning comes in on March 3rd of 2016. They go to the high school, begin to make the notifications, start interviewing, and then they're also going to backtrack Kedarie's steps. And so one of the things they do is they take Kedarie's cell phone and they're able to get that analyzed, and they're able to see that Kedarie was at this specific grocery store on the night of March 2nd. And from there, they can see that the phone is in like pinging connection with another phone, and it's moving towards a specific location. And that is where they're able to begin to narrow their focus in on Jaron Purham and Jorge Sander Galvez. And so it takes a while, all of this to unfold. Kedarie's killers would be free for a little over 2 years. It was around April of 2018 when Kedarie's killers were finally convicted of first-degree murder. And so, you know, as we go through this case, I just want to share with you all just a little bit of the trial footage that took place in Keokuk, Iowa.
In the trial of Jorge Sander Galvez, the first of two defendants accused in the death of Kedarie Johnson. Kedarie, 16, was a gender-fluid student at Burlington High School who sometimes dressed in women's clothing. His death sent shockwaves through the small Iowa community last year. Federal prosecutor Christopher Peras led opening arguments detailing some of Kedarie's final moments before his death.
You'll see on that Hy-Vee video that Kedarie was dressed like a girl. He had tight black leggings on, had his nails painted pink, had a pink headband, and long hair extensions to make him look like a female. And females? That was one thing the defendant and Jaron were into. Because of what the defendant did on March 2nd of last year, it was too late for Kedarie Johnson too. A young man with a bright future ahead of him. It's too late to bring Kedarie back, but it's not too late to bring his killers to justice.
And so that was from the federal prosecutor, Christopher Peras, who was, they were really trying to determine how to proceed with this case. The trial, again, did take place around October of 2017, and that was around October 14th. And so as this trial unfolded, one of the things that they were really trying to determine is if they should file hate crime charges. Was this case a case of first-degree murder? This teenage tragedy where Kedarie, 16, is seen leaving the store, as you heard in the testimony from federal prosecutor Christopher Peras, is leaving the store and is very female presenting and expressive. And so when they cross paths with Jorge and Jaron, it was just a recipe for a hateful homicide. And so the goal was for them to try to charge these two, convicted killers with a hate crime. Well, in the state of Iowa, they do have a hate crime statute around sexual orientation. But in 2016, at the time of the homicide, there was no hate crime statute around gender identity and or gender expression. So individuals like myself who identify as a trans woman, or individuals like Kedarie who identifies as gender non-binary, our cases would not warrant a hate crime statute. And so Kedarie's mother, Katrina, has been tirelessly fighting with the state of Iowa and even on a federal level to make sure that gender expression and gender identity is included in hate crime statutes for the state of Iowa. Well, also one of the things that I want to share with you as well is this idea of gender fluidity, gender nonconforming, and gender non-binary. Our gender non-binary, gender non-conforming community is a growing and thriving community, ranging from celebrities like Jesse James Keitel, as well as others in the community, from shows like Billions with characters such as Taylor, and amazing other visibility for our non-binary community members. It is happening. I personally have quite a few friends that identify as gender non-binary and gender non-conforming, and I am so happy to be able to share a little bit of that information for those who may not be familiar with gender non-binary and or gender non-conforming communities, and then trying to understand like what that looks like. So again, the gender non-binary is an individual who does not necessarily identify on either binary spectrum of male and or female. That can be cis and or trans, male or female. Gender non-binary typically will use pronouns such as they, them, theirs, and or even sometimes no pronouns. It just depends on the individual and their process and their journey. And so Kedarie was definitely still navigating through their gender journey as a gender non-conforming and gender fluid teen. At the age of 16, Kedarie definitely began to start to really find a connection with feminine expressive clothing and also hairstyles and nails. And so again, as you heard the federal prosecutor mention, Kedarie was quite often in female presenting items, and so it was, and very beautiful inside and out, funny, gregarious, and so when Jorge and Jaron saw Kedarie on the night of March 2nd around 9 p.m., they saw a beautiful Black a cis female that is in their minds in that moment on that night is who they saw and what they identified with. And so what's really interesting is that again, as I mentioned earlier, we talk about these elements of really identifying and understanding we as a trans community. And I think what's really important for people to understand is that we all don't express the same. I know myself as a binary trans woman, I'm very feminine expressive. I typically, dress more feminine and have, that, and that's my identity and my truth. But again, we have our non-binary community members, gender non-conforming community members. And again, it expands even so much more. We have a gender expansive community of gender queer and so many other identities. But, really what we want, and there's going to be several other cases that we cover throughout season 2 of A Hateful Homicide, where we look into this idea and of how we as a community can support and uplift our gender non-binary and gender non-conforming community members. One of the things that that has really grown from this non-binary visibility movement is the Non-Binary Awareness Week. And what's really amazing about the Non-Binary Awareness Week is that it really, really highlights this visibility that is much needed. And I just want to just share that with you all, just that for anyone who ever wants to know, when that is along the months of July. And it's also from July 12th to July 18th. And again, you can be an ally and or accomplice. There's resources ranging in multiple ways. And so please just know that that is available. And so again, one of the things that is really heartbreaking about this case too is that I really want to give you all a sense of Kedarie's mom, Kedarie Johnson, again, as a single mom, and Kedarie was her firstborn. Again, it's just really an understanding of what Kedarie was going through and the relationship that Kedarie had with Katrina. And so their relationship was really beautiful. When Kedarie was born on July 5th of 1999, Katrina was a young mom. And again, living in the urban area, she wanted to make sure that her children, especially at that time, who were, especially in their earlier years, were cis masked, and so wanted to make sure that they were less targeted by the cops, less targeted by any potential urban affiliations of gangs and or drugs. And so Katrina really navigated into moving to Burlington, a space that was going to be, safer. It was going to be more suburban. And so this crime should not have happened here, but unfortunately it did. And so what I really want to do is, and Katrina has just, again, tirelessly worked with, the state of Iowa as well as others. And during this time when Kedarie was first discovered murdered, shot in the alley, and then also when Kedarie was discovered as well, had to be identified by Katrina. Katrina was just so distraught and beside herself that she couldn't speak. And so during the sentencing back in April of 2018, especially Jorge Sander Galvez, the primary perpetrator of this hateful homicide, an advocate by the name of Penny Galvin spoke on behalf of Katrina during the sentencing to give that victim impact statement. And one of the things is that I just really want to share that with you all to give you an understanding of the grief that this mother has faced because of these two individuals.
My son, Kedarie Johnson, was a lucky son, brother, grandson, nephew, and cousin. He was very compassionate and caring. He had an infectious smile. Kedarie would walk into his doll room, and it would be filled with light and joy. His personality was amazing. So for my two other children, Cedric and Nigel, as well as myself and other family members, to deal with this is wrong. Kedarie was robbed and deprived of his life. He was still a baby, my lovely baby, who still has his whole life ahead of him. And from March 2nd, 2016, until I take my last breath, I will forever have a deep hole in my heart. His birthday and every special holiday, it doesn't even have to be one of those days, but just to wake up and not see his face, his smile, or hear his laugh. I can never hear him say, "I love you, Mom," ever again. Who would have ever thought that "see you later" actually meant "see you later"? No one knows what it feels like to not sleep. It's coming up on 2 years that Kedarie's been gone. All I have left of him is his ashes, pictures, and videos. That still doesn't make it better. No punishment can ever bring back my son, because it won't be enough. Even though Jorge Sander Galvez will spend the rest of his life behind bars, at least he still has the rest of his life. He'll be able to have visits from his family, see pictures of his son growing up, and be able to share in what the life experiences that his family celebrates. I only have memories of my son. I do hope he gets the punishment he deserves and rots in hell. Thank you, Kedarie Johnson, the proud mother of Kedarie Johnson.
And again, as you could hear, Kedarie's mom, heartbroken, saddened, beside herself. She couldn't even speak. And you can actually see this footage on YouTube under Kedarie's victim statement. And one of the things that's really heartbreaking, or I think it's just also a further insult to injury, is to see, Jorge as Penny Galvin is reading this victim impact statement from Kedarie's mother. Jorge rolls his eyes. He doesn't care. He's not fazed. He's not bothered by the fact that this mother of 3 is now a mother of 2. That this mother has to only recollect and reflect through the visual of ashes, pictures, and video footage. The last footage of seeing Kedarie leave the store, Katrina still watches that just to have a visual of their child's last moments. And Jorge rolls his eyes. Jaron, on the other hand, has always expressed some form of remorse. He's always stated that, he wishes that he could have, stopped George from doing this hateful homicide to Kedarie. He also expressed that he wished that he could have encouraged George to calm down, but unfortunately he did not. And the reality is that Kedarie has been murdered. And, Jaron has to face his crime, and he has to face his charges. And that's exactly what happens. So both of them are convicted and sentenced to over 20 years in prison. And they will spend the rest of their lives in the Iowa State Department of Corrections. And so as we, again, prepare to wrap up this case, this teenage tragedy, this hateful homicide, I just really want to, give you all this sense of how we need to continue to be more empathetic. We need to really be willing to learn. And for anyone in my audience who, again, is still learning about the trans experience, the gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender expansive communities, please reach out to us. There's tons of resources from our LGBTQ centers to, also resource guides that are available through Google searches, as well as the Trans Resource Hub. Please reach out to us. Because the reality is that our community as a trans and gender non-conforming and gender non-binary community is growing. And so we are here, and what we want to make sure is that these cases against our non-binary, non-conforming community members do not grow in the same amount as our trans femme and our trans masc. And so that's why it's really important to make sure that we raise awareness around these cases. And so one of the things that I really also just want to share with you is just another moment. And this is actually from Kedarie's mom, just in her own words, the grief that she has had to go through. I just want to share that with you all as we prepare to conclude this episode of A Hateful Homicide.
My son was tragically and horrifically murdered, and I can never come back from it. Just to know that the last words my baby ever said to me was, "See you later, Ma, I love you." And to only come to terms with myself to know that his "see you later" actually meant "see you later." I can't get that back. I'm just in a dark cloud, a dark bubble that I can never come out of, I'm still numb from the fact. I know he's gone, I know it's gonna be 2 years he's gone, but it still does not feel real to me. If they are indicted on a hate crime, the death penalty is a possibility of punishment. And as harsh as it may sound, I would love to sit side by side with their parents and watch their children die.
And as you could hear, Kedarie Johnson, this grief-stricken mother, heartbroken by the fact that her eldest child, her 16-year-old, just a sophomore in high school, is now murdered. And this teenage tragedy, again, it's really heartbreaking, but you could hear the anger as well. And as if you ever get a chance to look at this footage, she's cradling this black and bronze urn, almost like a newborn baby. And it's just a really evoking image because it shows you that she truly carries Kedarie with her everywhere she goes. And if you learn anything from these cases as we continue to go through, please understand, if you have been someone who has been a bully, who has done violence, understand the impact that you're causing these victims' families. Kedarie was just trying to live their life, stand in their truth and be them best selves, loving themselves, being happy and thriving as a sophomore in high school. When on March 2nd, 2016, at just 10 p.m., they would be met with a hateful homicide by the hands of Jorge Sander Galvez and Jaron Purham. So, again, in conclusion, I want to say to you, Kedarie, also known as Candace, we remember you, love bug. Yesterday, today, forever, and always born July 5th, 1999, and resting on since March 2nd, 2016. We remember you. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of A Hateful Homicide. My name is Mallory Jenna Robinson. Please follow us on Instagram at A Hateful Homicide. You can follow me on Instagram at MalloryJenna90. We're also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And we're also, again, on the Anchor app. Thank you all so much for tuning in to Season 2, Episode 2. And stay tuned for next week, next Saturday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.